Hello, welcome to Books in the World. My name is Richard Bodertha, and today I'll be your host. Books in the World is a venture in association with the Cape Cod Writers Center. Our guest here today is Professor Daniel Payne, who has written a book about Henry Beston. It's called Orion on the Dunes. Welcome, Daniel.
Well, thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here on Books in the World.
Great. You are a professor currently up at University of New York State College up in Oneonta, I believe, and you're a professor of English up there. But when you were a young man, you started out, at least one of the jobs you had was as a clam digger down in Long Island. And at that point, you became very interested in the environmental movement. There really wasn't too much of a movement back then. But one day you happened on a book called The Outermost House.
Right.
And as many people here on the Cape know, that book is really a landmark in nature writing. It was about Henry Beston's stay on the eastern beach for about a year in a small little castle, his castle. Actually, it was a little shack.
Right.
Why don't you describe initially, Daniel, if you would, a little bit about Henry Beston and why he's so relevant to the environmental movement?
He is well known for the outermost house, living on the great beach of Cape Cod for a year. And he is, in literary circles, considered to be one of the finest stylists of the 20th century. In fact, the critic Van Wyck Brooks said of Henry Beston that if literary style, literary quality was the main criterion for a writer's reputation, that writers like Henry Beston and Rachel Carson would be esteemed above all others. But there is a deeper part to his work that has to do with the growth of the environmental movement. He was a key turning point between the early environmental movement, people like John Burroughs, John Muir, Teddy Roosevelt, who were mainly concerned with preserving the land and with areas of scenic importance, you know, the Yosemite, the Sequoia, the Grand Canyon. And then we have the later environmental movement that really starts with Rachel Carson, where the notion of environmental protection expands to regional, national, and even global concerns. Henry Beston is a transitional figure because he and writers such as Aldo Leopold, who wrote a Sand County Almanac, started to talk about issues that went beyond land use issues and led to the later environmental movement. And Henry Beston, for example, one of the people who was most influenced by Henry Beston was Rachel Carson, the author of Silent Spring.
And a lot of people will say that that really started the environmental movement. I believe that was in 1962.
Right.
I'd like to place Henry Beston a little bit in historical context.
Sure.
He was a young man back in World War I. So he was born 1890s, 1880, I presume.
June 1st, 1888.
Okay. All right. Now, one of the precepts about his work is about the new age of machines and the impact that it had on the natural world. And of course, he was a volunteer in World War I, and he had firsthand knowledge of what the world was becoming to be. Can you describe a little bit how he got involved in World War I? He was a volunteer before the United States got involved in the war.
That's right. Like many young Americans, particularly college-age Americans, he sympathized with the democracies of Europe in their battle against the autocracies. So France and England were aided by a number of young Americans who came over either to fight in the war or as members, like Henry Besson, of the American Field Service, the Ambulance Corps.
Right. Ernest Hemingway, I believe, did that.
Hemingway, John Dos Passos, Malcolm
Right.
Cowley. The phenomenon of the literary volunteers is a remarkable one. And one of the interesting things is that Henry Beston he was not Henry Beston yet. He still retained his birth name, Henry Edward Sheehan. And under that name, he served in World War I. He wrote 2 books about World War I, but he is rarely considered with the literary volunteers because he later went on to fame as Henry Beston.
I see.
So a lot of people who've written about the literary volunteers figured this guy just disappeared, never gained a literary reputation. In fact, he did.
I see. Well, his mother was French, and I believe
right.
you make a point in your book that perhaps the idea of learning, he was, of course, taught French when he was growing up,
right.
and that added to its felicity with the English language even.
That's what he claimed, that coming from a bilingual household greatly affected his writing style.
I see.
And it also affected his desire to side with France during the Great War.
Yeah.
It gave him an advantage because when he was in France, he spoke flawless Parisian French. So he was able to talk to ordinary people. He spent a good 6 months, a little more than 6 months, in France on the Western Front, and served during some of the most horrific action, including the Battle of Verdun.
Right.
And he describes that in his first book, A Volunteer Poilu. And his experience in the war convinced him that modern mechanized industrial war was a destructive influence on the human spirit, and that we needed to do something to reconnect with the natural rhythms of the earth rather than be exposed to or dominated by modern industrial life. You know, for example, he writes in The Outermost House, you know, we seem to be afraid of night. You know, there's artificial lights everywhere. He says we can't stand going out into the dark, and yet, you know, he was a big fan of the constellations, and yet, he said, we lose something when we gain this fear of dark, of the night.
Sure. The title of the book is Orion on the Dunes. Can you go over how you came up with that title? As I understand it, you got the title first, and then you,
Right.
which might have helped you focus on the thematic portion of what you were trying to say. But what was his relationship with astronomy and Orion, the hunter?
Yeah, he loved astronomy, and his favorite constellation was Orion the Hunter. There was a chapter in the Outermost House called Orion Rises on the Dunes. So the title had a lot to do with Henry Beston himself, and the dunes, of course, were where he lived in that shack during that year. After writing most of the book, I started thinking about what the overall interconnecting theme was, and at first I came up blank, and then realized that it had been there all along. Orion is the hunter, and what Henry Beston was doing was hunting for meaning in that post-war world, trying to find something that replaced the institutions, churches, government, schools, that had been, at least in part, discredited by what happened during the war.
Yeah. Well, another famous biographer, Leon Edel, I believe that's how you pronounce the last name, always said that the autobiography was trying to find a portrait of the person, the search for the inwardness and inner myth, of an individual. And I'd like you, if you would, to read a passage from your book that really typifies his inwardness and why he felt the urge to go out onto that little cabin on the beach and live for a year and write this book called The Outermost House. Do you have a passage there that you'd like to read?
I think so.
Okay.
And here he's talking about moving to Cape Cod to live for a year on this dune shack at the top of a dune on the ocean.
Well, he first only wants to do it for a couple of weeks, I believe.
That's right. It was first supposed to be a 2-week vacation.
Yeah, a little hiatus from the hustle and bustle, so to speak.
That's
but it
right.
evolved into something more than that.
That's right.
Yeah.
I was anxious to see what a year, more or less alone, in the midst of great natural beauty would mean. Cape Cod had good people, hospitable to wild and unexpected things. I called my house Forecastle, which is the name of the cruise quarters on sailing vessels. When I moved in, I intended to stay a couple of weeks. I had no particular plans beyond this. Everything just went ahead, developed in its own way. The weeks lingered on until I knew my stay would be a whole year. I found that I lived in the midst of an abundance of natural life, which manifested itself every hour of the day. I couldn't leave, for there was too much to discover in the natural, beautiful world that man often forgets is here. Man is Earth's child, who must not, in the mechanized and intellectualized forces of our modern age, lose touch with the rhythms she provides. Man must touch the earth, love the earth, honor the earth, and rest his spirit in her solitary places. Nature provides man the peace he needs very badly. I could see that living in outer nature keeps the senses keen, and living alone stirs in them a certain watchfulness. I was a little deaf and nearsighted, but nature manifested itself within me, and I was keenly aware of her presence. Living indoors is only a journey along a paper calendar. Living in outer nature is sharing in the pilgrimages of the sun. And in that passage, I think you have many of the primary themes that connect his later works.
Nature being the oldest of all human connections.
Yeah.
Now, of course, there were some predecessors in the environmental nature writing, most notably, I suppose, Henry David Thoreau,
Yes.
who also visited Cape Cod. Did he ever write anything about the Cape?
He did. He wrote a book on Cape Cod.
Oh, he did. Okay.
And Beston was keenly aware of the influence of Henry Thoreau. In fact, he joked to his wife-to-be, Elizabeth Coatsworth, he called himself the Thoroughborough, a tribute to Henry and John Burroughs.
Right. Now, back in those days, people had friends that they wrote continuously, not continuously,
Yes.
but unlike we do today, with the email and everything, nothing really has any permanence, it seems. But he did develop some very good friendships that helped him along the way. I know there was one friend, a female, who actually sent him socks during World War I.
Right.
And if he was living in the trenches, I'm sure he would have needed that.
Mabel Davison.
Mabel
yes.
Davison, okay. And how did they meet?
They met when Henry was on the Western Front.
Yeah.
And Mabel Davison, like many women of the time, British and French women, would send packages of necessities
Care
to soldiers,
package.
care packages to soldiers on the front.
Yeah.
And she sent one to Henry, and he wrote back a heartfelt thank you.
Yeah.
And it developed from there, and they became lifelong friends after that. In fact, Henry dedicates the Outermost House to Mabel Davison.
Oh, he did.
Who we called Moraine, which is a wartime godmother. So
I
he
see.
often called her Moraine.
He used to write her letters about some of the shipwrecks he would see.
Yes, constantly. There was one, and this is an interesting story, because in the Outermost House, it was a very bad winter, the winter he was there, 1926 to 27. And he wrote about a number of the shipwrecks. And he said, to understand Cape Cod, you have to understand that is a place of elemental destruction, you know, and that the Cape Codders, you know, if a ship goes down, they scavenge, you know, that's part of the cycle of life on the Cape. Well, there was a ship that went down, a Pioneer, right in the beginning of his time there, and he became involved with the rescue effort. The Coast Guardsmen were there. They would take the survivors to Henry's shack, where he would give them blankets and hot rum toddies to revive them. He probably had more of a connection with that shipwreck than any of the ones that he wrote about in the rest of the book, and yet he left the Pioneer incident out. And I believe it may have been because Henry's shack on the top of the Great Dune was isolated. And he had some friends at the Outlook Inn, which is still here today. But in those days, there were no trees between the dunes and the Outlook Inn. And so they used to, in bad weather, they would flash signals, lantern signals to each other, sometimes in Morse code. Well, some of Henry's neighbors quite understandably thought he might be a bootlegger because this was during Prohibition. And I wonder if he left that story out because he talks about giving hot rum toddies to the survivors, and it might have kind of exemplified the notion that he was a bootlegger and not simply a dune dweller. So.
He turned out really to be a farmer.
Yes, he did.
And moved to Maine, I believe,
Maine.
and wrote books about his experience up there.
That's right. In the early 1930s,
he was married.
Yes.
Describe his marriage a little bit. I know when he proposed to his wife-to-be, she said, no, we hadn't written a book yet, and he was, I don't know if he was stuck or whatever, but she sort of induced him to finish the book by saying, no book, no marriage.
Yes. That has long been the legend, and it may be factual. I couldn't find any evidence of that specifically, and in fact, Henry's daughter, Kate Beston Barnes, said that it never happened. Oh. But it's a wonderful legend anyway.
Yeah. Describe for us a little bit about the enormous amount of research you did. This is quite a scholarly work, but it reads, you don't need to come from academia to thoroughly enjoy it. But all the people that you met along the way, and also to get permission to delve into his papers and to write the biography. I guess the wife did not give permission to a number of people.
That's right.
Prior.
That's right. I got very lucky. Kate Beston Barnes, Henry and Elizabeth's daughter, was the literary executor at the time when I was looking to write the book. But I didn't know that, and I didn't know if there were any survivors. You know, Beston had two daughters. I knew nothing about them because, of course, they had both gotten married, and I didn't know what their last names were.
Right. Well, okay, kind of place where you are at this point. Of course, you were digging for clams. You bought, when you're 19, 20 years old, you bought the outermost house. I believe you became a lawyer.
Right.
Then you went to get your doctorate. You left the law behind.
Right.
But ever since you read that book, The Outermost House, you've been thinking in your mind, you know, you're kind of fascinated with the environmental movement and also this person, Henry Beston, and you determined that no biography has ever been read.
That's it.
Written, excuse me, written about him.
That's right. I was asked by John Elder, one of my dissertation advisors, because my dissertation was on nature writing and environmental politics.
Yeah.
And he asked me to write a couple of articles in the American Nature Writers reference series. And I quickly chose Henry Beston because he was one of my favorites.
Yeah.
And
he gave you a choice between Peter Matheson and...
yeah, and I took both of them.
Yeah.
And I realized that there was no biography on either of them, which was going to make my job a lot more difficult. And then I realized that, wait a minute, how could there be no biography on Henry Beston? And so from then on, I started working toward it. I got very lucky because Barry Lopez, the great writer, visited
Arctic Dreams.
Arctic Dreams, yes, you know, wonderful writer. He visited the college where I'm teaching for a 3 or 4 day visit, and I was given the task of being one of his chaperones.
Oh.
And after a couple of days there, Barry turns to me and he says, "You know, Dan, I'm sick of talking about myself. What are you working on?" And I mentioned the biography of Beston and my difficulty in finding the literary executor. And Barry looks at me and says, "I happen to be very good friends with Kate Beston Barnes." He says, "I'll write to her and tell her you're okay," which he did, as good as his word. I didn't call her right away, so he sent me another postcard and says, "Dan, call her." I did. I sent her a copy of my first book. She liked it. And the project bloomed from there. So
Wow.
Kate was a wonderful help all the way through. Gave me
Right.
full access to all the archives, told me the most wonderful stories
Wow.
about her family, and got me in connection with so many other people who were helpful. Her two cousins,
Yeah.
Marie Sheehan and Joni Schwab. Perhaps most importantly, Gary Lawless and Beth Leonard, who are amazing people. They're longtime caretakers of Chimney Farm, the Beston Farm.
That's in Maine, correct?
In Maine,
Right.
that's right. Gary's also a wonderful poet. They own one of the best independent bookstores I've ever been to. I just met so many people who were tremendously helpful to me.
Now, the individual who wrote the prologue or the introduction for The Outermost House is Robert Finch.
Yes.
Who, of course, was a great nature writer, too. Can you
One
describe?
of my favorites.
Okay. Well, go over your association with him and how he helped you.
I didn't have a direct association with Robert, other than being a huge fan of his work. But my publisher, David R. Godine, did. And so he asked Robert to write a buddy blurb for the book. And Robert read the book and did that. And since then, we've been in touch.
Yeah.
He told me he finally got a chance to read the whole thing, and he loved it.
David
High praise.
Godine publishes well-known publishing house, a smaller one, but
Yes.
highly esteemed here in Boston. How did your book find a home there?
David Godine is a huge fan of Henry Beston's, and he's published a number of Beston's books. He's also published a number of books by Beston's daughter, Kate Beston Barnes, who was, by the way, the first poet laureate of Maine. She's an excellent poet. And when David heard, actually from Gary Lawless, that I was almost finished with this book, he told Gary, "Tell him to send it to me." And we met up at Chimney Farm one day for a Beston celebration, and David reiterated that I should send him the book. And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I have a manuscript in the back of my car. I'll give it to you now."
You make your own luck.
You make your own luck, exactly. And David read it, really liked it, and the rest was history.
Wow.
At least publication history.
Wow. One of Henry Beston's friends, of course, was Teddy Roosevelt's son, Teddy Jr.
Yes.
And I want you to describe a little tidbit of history here that I never knew had I not read your book. But they went to Harvard together, Teddy Jr. as well as Henry Beston. But describe their association. Also, the Roosevelt family being environmentalists at the vanguard, really, of the environmental movement. The national parks and that kind of thing. Why don't you describe the relationship with Teddy Jr.?
Well, they first met as undergraduates at Harvard and became friendly there. And their friendship deepened after graduation. They stayed in touch. Henry Beston visited Sagamore Hill, the Roosevelt house. There were some family legends about things that happened there with wild animals and the president himself. So they became very close. When Henry wrote his fairy tales, he always sent a copy to the Roosevelt children. And
By fairy tales, Henry later got involved in the writing of fairy tales.
That's right.
His wife was also a children's author.
Exactly, exactly. And she published over 100 books in her lifetime.
Wow.
Which was sometimes a source of tension between them, because she was so prolific and Henry wrote so slowly and painfully. But the fairy tales that he sent to the Roosevelt children, really cemented what was already a strong friendship.
Mm-hmm.
And when Ted Jr. died in World War II, he was one of the officers leading the assault at Normandy.
Can you go into that a little bit? I mean, I have a picture from reading your book about Teddy Jr., age 56,
Mm-hmm.
on the beach at Normandy.
With a cane.
With a cane, a bad ticker,
Yeah.
arthritis,
Yes.
and with a steady voice and steady hand kind of leading the...
Exactly right.
I mean, he might not have been running up the
That's
right.
right.
beach, but he was pretty close to it.
That's right. Encouraging the men every step of the way, taking the lead. And then
Yeah.
after the battle was won, he went to his tent feeling tired, and he died of a massive heart attack.
Wow.
And when he did, and when Beston heard about it, he was shattered.
Really?
He was already anti-war. This just made it personal.
Right. Cape Cod, let's get back to that. That was Beston's focus in prime inspiration, really, the
Yes.
Cape. He lived at other places, but how did he see Cape Cod in a nutshell? How should we see Cape Cod? What is so different about Cape Cod?
That's a great question, and I think what was so different was if you're on the beach, every day is different. The land is changing constantly.
Yeah.
You are right in there with the rhythms of nature.
Well, good. That's a great description. I'm sorry, we probably have to end it with that. I'm sure you could go on about Cape Cod indefinitely. Really, it's a great place.
Yeah, it sure
a great
is.
book. As I mentioned, it's a scholarly book, but thoroughly enjoyable. It really gets into the heart, not only of the Cape, but the man behind the myth, so to speak. A wonderful book, and we thank you very much for it.
My pleasure.
And thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Richard.